Hi, my name is Alan Maleche. I'm the Executive Director at KELIN. KELIN is Kenya Legal and Ethical Issues Network on HIV and AIDS, an NGO based in Kenya that focuses on issues of health and human rights. On the 14th of April, we were part of a webinar hosted by the Graduate Institute of Geneva, the Global Health Center, by Dr. Meg Davis, where I was a panelist speaking about human rights in the context of COVID, alongside colleagues from WHO, from UNAIDS, and a human rights activist from China. During that particular call, we managed to talk about a number of things, including about lockdowns, the quarantines, and how excessive policing was affecting access to healthcare services. After the blog and after the webinar series, Dr. Joel from Middlesex University in London reached out to us, indicating that she was running a series of blogs about COVID-19 and the state of emergencies, and wanted us to contribute to that. So I joined forces with my colleagues Tara and Nerima to be able to put together a blog about excessive law enforcement in the times of COVID in Kenya. And I'm here with my colleague Tara, who will speak more about the blog that we wrote and get to let the world know, and our people who follow our work and are interested in our work, on why did we write this blog, what are some of the 3 issues people should remember about this blog.
Okay, so thank you, Alan. Basically, the blog highlights the government's measures towards the COVID-19 pandemic. And to start with, we discuss the initial government measures put in place, which included the international travel bans, the suspension of learning institutions, self-quarantine, as well as mandatory quarantine. And it also discusses the establishment of the National Emergency Response Committee, which is basically in charge of coordinating and managing and preparing the country's response to the pandemic. Other things we talked about were the rules put in place, which were emanated from the Public Health Act and the Public Order Act. So these rules included the cessation of movement rules, as well as the curfew rules, whereby Kenyans were not allowed to move about outside the curfew times, which were between 7 a.m. and 5 p.m. And basically we discussed that, and we discussed the issues surrounding policing with respect to the breaking of the curfew rules. That's a major problem discussed in the blog, as well as the issue of mandatory quarantine, which was basically extended beyond the initial 14-day period due to issues such as positive cases being found in these government facilities. Essentially, one of the major issues with mandatory quarantine was that those who broke the curfew rules were forced into these mandatory quarantine facilities. That's not provided for by the law, and the laws actually provide for certain penalties if such a case should arise. So that, of course, brought about a lot of uproar from the community.
So in your view, and in the blog that we wrote, your view is that people are not supposed to be taken to quarantine when they breached the regulations on curfew.
Yes.
But what do you think triggered for them to be taken to quarantine?
Basically, the government felt that those who were found outside the quarantine period were basically providing a risk to the community, because for some reason they assume that you've caught the virus because you're outside your home at that time. And this was very unusual, because mandatory quarantine was only meant for those traveling from other countries, just to force them to quarantine for 14 days, just to protect the public, just in case there were positive cases among them. So this was a very unusual response.
Does that speak to the excessive law enforcing, or does it speak to unconstitutional enforcing of things?
I think it's unconstitutional enforcement, because there are no laws that back that kind of action. So I think it was actually declared unconstitutional, rather the way police were handling those who are breaking curfew. Instead of actually directing citizens to the law in terms of how much they're supposed to pay and the consequences, there was a lot of issues surrounding bribery and excessive policing. So that was a major issue, yeah, that we discussed in the blog.
And any measures in place in terms of either the National Assembly or the Senate are put in place to try and address this pandemic? Did the blog capture any of these issues?
Yes, so basically we discussed the role of Parliament during this pandemic, and essentially we brought about how Parliament is essentially supposed to scrutinize these rules that are gazetted, the rules, the cessation of movement rules and the curfew rules. But these were being enforced before that was happening, because Parliament was at a standstill for a short period of time, initially once the pandemic was within our territory. And basically now they're sitting at the moment. However, these rules were basically approved further down the line after all these issues I've discussed came to be. And basically, I think that's the main issue surrounding parliamentary involvement, because now we're having a situation where this is being done after the fact, after the issues have arisen. And another good thing, though, is Parliament has before them the pandemic response bill, which is essentially a bill that is supposed to prepare the country in case another pandemic occurs, and basically provides for an array of issues. For example, it provides for a fund that will be utilized if a pandemic is to occur. It provides for socio-economic measures and just ways to cushion and protect the country in case a pandemic occurs, because we found that we were caught unaware because there were no laws that really provided for how the country would respond to such a situation.
Oh, that's really interesting. And given that the blog is highly captured for an audience that has a legal background, what would be your 3 key messages for someone who is not in the legal profession? We know the COVID pandemic is across the globe. What are the 3 key messages coming out of this blog that we've jointly done? Okay.
Basically, this blog informs the public that there is no state of emergency as of yet. The government is currently just trying to protect the country in using rules and measures that some are constitutional, others are not backed by any legal basis. Another thing I would say is that I think, given the circumstances, the country's response has been lacking in terms of transparency, accountability, and information. So a lot of things are being done without the knowledge of the public. So I think the blog basically just highlights that there are systems in place that are supposed to guide this whole process, and it basically brings to light the issues that are coming about from policing and issues to do with approval of these rules that have already been implemented. So those are some of the things I would say.
Thanks, Tara. Really glad to have you here today to discuss this blog around excessive law enforcement during a time of the COVID pandemic. And I'll be turning shortly to my colleague Nerima Were, who also co-authored this particular article with us, and she'll be speaking more to the recommendations and what exactly can governments do, whether it's in Kenya, whether it's in other countries, what exactly can you do in order to ensure that you live within the confines of the Constitution, but you're also able to manage the pandemic. I'm now joined by my colleague in the profession, Nerima Akinyi-Were, who will be speaking to us about what are some of the way forwards based on our blog on excessive law enforcement. So welcome, Nerima. What's your thought in terms of us moving forward this conversation on excessive law enforcement? What are some of the things you've seen, and how do you think some of these things can be remedied by the different players in this country?
They're very good questions to consider around who has the responsibility to pay for quarantine and who has the responsibility to ensure that people are placed in quarantine when you're curtailing people's liberty. So in that sense, we would say obviously the state, and ask the state to push for measures to pay for quarantine. They have done that already. However, that's only for people going into quarantine thereafter. A second thing to consider is whether or not people should be held in quarantine as part of punishment or as a penal provision. I would say no, they should not, and the state should also consider any public policy measure must be within the rule of law. So holding people in curfew, holding curfew breakers holding places or in mandatory quarantine facilities because they breached curfew is completely unlawful, and they should consider going through a process where they'll consider if the curfew is fit for purpose, or they should consider another way to engage with Kenyans to ensure that we are not moving around at night.
But there's an insistence that putting people in curfew holding places and in quarantine is protecting the larger public and the common mwananchi. What's your take on that in light of the blog?
Well, I wouldn't say it is, because the first question should be, why are people still breaching curfew? So there's two questions of, is it consistent in discipline by Kenyans, or is there something that's not resonating in the messaging from the state? And they have to continue to ensure that you're speaking to your people in a way that they understand and that they can follow your measures. And if they're not, if you have a penal provision, you have to go through court. For the Ministry of Health to tell us, we will assume that you came into contact with COVID-19 patients or with the coronavirus, what guides that assumption? And how does the law play out if that's your assumption that you're making, guided by nothing else? So those are some of the things that they have to consider. So even though people are breaking the law, possibly, it has to be proven and they have to be convicted before you can take a decision on a curfew breakers holding place. The second thing I would advise or suggest or recommend at this stage is around the judiciary. The judiciary has done a wonderful job to some extent in this period. Initially, there was a slowdown in operations, but they have come back. They've put measures in place to ensure we can continue accessing justice. However, because of the measures we have in place, we're seeing a lot more cases around the pandemic and the pandemic response itself. And all these cases are emergency at this stage. They're all urgent because the pandemic is not here for the next 10 years, we hope. But the measures being implemented are very drastic and very punitive. So we have to ensure that that cases are being heard on an urgent basis almost consistently, which then might require the judiciary to consider, should we have somebody sitting on a special bench for COVID-19 matters? I would say they should. And the Law Society of Kenya should be pushing this agenda as well. Should have like a special dedicated judge or a special dedicated bench towards the COVID-19 pandemic cases to ensure that the rule of law is being upheld.
Why do you think we need a dedicated judge or dedicated bench towards COVID-19 cases?
Because of the urgency of the matters and the fact that, I can use one example. All of the regulations that are being published and being implemented with almost immediate effect. By the time we go to court, or by the time Parliament seeks to sit down and consider whether or not these are legal or these are lawful or constitutional, already you have so many cases that have gone. For instance, with a curfew, by the time the court considered it, 6 people had died the first night. We can't get those 6 people back. And other people died thereafter, but 6 people had already died. We can't get those 6 people back. So by the time the court says excessive force is unconstitutional, people have already died. So it's very urgent to ensure that the measures that are coming out of the executive at this point are being checked expeditiously. The other thing that I would speak on, and we've already leaned into that, is police brutality at this time. I have mentioned that 6 people died on the first night of curfew, but it's a consistent question, not just in terms of policing, but what it means to put police in charge of public health measures. So when we have the Ministry of Health recommending that people who are caught breaching curfew are held in curfew breakers holding places, we are then putting police in charge of public health. And this is a very difficult position to put police in charge of, only because they don't have the training for it. Additionally, we have a lot of measures within the rules and regulations that have been placed that are asking Ministry of Health officials or doctors and nurses to play a policing role, such as going into people's homes without warranties, without anything beforehand to guide them, but going into people's homes to ensure that people who may have been infected, who have come into contact, are either quarantined within those homes or taken out to other facilities. If I'm a doctor, I would find that very difficult. You're just telling me to go into a home. I don't know what's there, what dangers I might be leading into, and also what right do I have to just invade people's privacy without guided by any other form of law?
But noting that this pandemic is not unique to Kenya,
yes.
What advice and what recommendation comes out from the paper that would be able to help other ministries of health not to abdicate their duties to the police, and vice versa, the police abdicating some of their duties to the Ministry of Health? What kind of advice would you give around that?
So I would start by saying we do need to continue to employ a rights-based approach to health. I say continue because I'm hoping we'll start at some point and then continue, but maybe I should say we need to start employing a rights-based approach to health. And that really will have the ministry working with other ministries and with the police consider What are we trying to achieve by any specific measure, and how can we do it in a way that is guided by the Constitution? And something like mandatory quarantine, a number of things could have been done beforehand to ensure that this was rights-based. For one, providing the people who are to be quarantined with information, providing them with options, having a policy guideline in place, ensuring that all costs are catered for, ensuring that testing was done in a timely fashion, ensuring that results were communicated to the persons in a timely fashion and privately, and then ensuring that people who were found negative were allowed to go to their homes with proper guidance. Those are some of the things that can be put in place. Another thing to be considered in this time, other than a rights-based approach to health, and that really does go across the board on very many health facets, is it's an opportunity to build public trust. We have countries like Germany, South Korea, who have actually managed to flatten their curve without going into lockdown, without doing social distancing, only based off of mass testing. And the reason they can do this is because their public trusts them. So when they employ any measures, people will actually stay home if asked to. People will go for mass tests if asked to. Kenyans are being begged to go for testing, and they're not going because they don't trust that the government won't try and lock them up 5 minutes thereafter if they're found to be positive. These are continuous concerns, because if we don't trust our state, we will not follow it. And this is not a concern because of this pandemic. It's a governance concern that they've had for the last decade, and they need to consider, how do we start to ensure that the constitution that we have, we're putting in place measures around integrity, accountability, transparency that will ensure that our people trust us enough that if we're in an emergency, they know we have their best interests at heart.
You've spoken about the judiciary, you've spoken about the police, and you've spoken about the Ministry of Health. And what does the blog talk about the role of parliaments, the role of county assemblies who play an oversight role? What would be the key recommendations to those bodies?
The key recommendations to parliament and county assemblies, to start with county assemblies, is to actually wake up and start being part of this conversation. There's been a marked absence of county assemblies and executives in this entire process. The only time we hear from counties is if it's a county that is affected, and that's only been Mombasa, quite frankly. There's other counties that are affected, but we're not hearing from them. We're not hearing from the government or their assemblies. Their role, the function of health is devolved. So primary health functions really do sit with county governments. And something like this, it's a pandemic, prevention, preventive health, promotive health really does sit with county governments. So even the dissemination of guidelines and policies shouldn't be coming from the Ministry of Health alone. The ability to adopt those guidelines and policies towards your county, that you don't have to wait for the Ministry of Health to guide you on that. So that's what county executives should be doing. County assemblies should be checking, especially where there are cases, how is money being spent, how are regulations being adopted, are these fit for purpose? Parliament, the Senate has started a bit late, maybe 2 months into the pandemic, to play a role. However, this should be something that was started from the beginning, because regulations are being passed and they have an obligation to ensure that these regulations are constitutional and lawful and fit for purpose. And sitting on this and only doing it thereafter once measures have already been put in place and are running is problematic. Only checking how money is being spent 2 months into a pandemic is problematic. They need to start taking their role more seriously and doing this oversight almost on a weekly basis, because things are happening on a weekly basis. We can't wait for 2 months to check expenditure. Do it week by week. The same way the government is passing regulations week by week, giving updates day by day. Senate should be doing the same thing. The National Assembly should be doing the same thing. County Assembly should be doing the same thing.
Great. And for the common citizen who is neither a lawyer, a member of the Ministry of Health, a member of the Senate or the County Assembly, what's the take-home message for them? What's their role in trying to ensure that this pandemic stays under control?
The role is to try and follow the directives by government. I know I have explained that it's been very difficult to do so because we don't have a relationship of trust. However, for the most part, the directives and the guidelines are for our own good. So if we're being asked to wear masks in public places, and as far as we can afford to do so, let us wear masks in public places. If we're being asked to social distance, and as far as we can afford to do so, let us observe social distancing. But mostly, let us ensure we're also holding our governments to account in this period. So this is not a lull for us as citizens to just sit and wait. We have to be asking these difficult questions as well of our governments. We have to be asking our county governors, where are you in this conversation? Our MPs, where are you in this conversation? If we know a judge, ask them, why is there no special COVID-19 bench? We need cases to be heard. So we also have a role of holding our state to account in this period.
So thanks for these important highlights, Nerima. Really good to see the recommendations, and we hope that the powers that be will listen. But let's end in Swahili so that we can also connect with the people on the ground. I know this is your favorite language. And kwa Kiswahili, je, unaweza tueleza kama mimi ni Mkenya ambaye niko nyumbani, je, jukumu langu ni nini, na naona kuwa polisi wanatumia nguvu sana, labda Bwana Mutahi Kagwe anatuambia tuvae mask tukae nyumbani, je, jukumu langu ni lini na ni jinsi gani sheria inaweza nilinda kama Mkenya?
So ningependa kuambia Wakenya, serikali hataki kuwazuia sana. Si kila kitu wanataka kuwazuia, lakini inabidi wasikilize na uangalie na waulize maswali. Na kwa hii muda, kama haki zako zimedhulumiwa ama umeshahidi haki za mwingine zikudhulumiwa, tafadhali tupigie kwa hii nambari ama utupate kwa barua la pepe.
Asante Nerima kwa kuongea na sisi leo. Colleagues and friends, thank you for listening on the blog today. We hope you will take time to read the blog on excessive law enforcement. It's our hope that indeed the relevant stakeholders have listened to this and they will be able to do their right part, follow the law, stick within the constitution so that we can save all the lives of Kenyans and avoid unnecessary deaths and unnecessary human rights violations. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time. Bye.